A man in a hollow in western North Carolina needs a house. He has the logs down and notched. What he does not have is the ability to lift a wall, because a green log wall is not something one man moves, and there is no crane within 200 miles, and no such thing as a crane at all. So word goes out. And on the appointed morning, a dozen men come up the road on foot, with axes and mauls and cant hooks, and they stay all day, and by dark there are 4 walls standing. Nobody is paid, nobody signs anything, nobody counts hours, and every single one of those men will be back at his own place next spring or next autumn, and this man will walk up the road with an axe to meet them there. That is the rule this video is about, and almost every telling of it gets it wrong in the same sentimental way. It is usually described as neighborliness, or community spirit, or people looking out for each other. That is not what it was, and softening it that far removes the part that actually worked. The rule was harder, stranger, and considerably less comfortable than kindness. It said, you go whether or not you like the man. It said your presence is not a favor and cannot be refused without cost. And it contained one requirement that runs directly against every instinct a modern person has been trained into. You are never allowed to get square. A debt in that system was not a problem to be cleared. The debt was the relationship, and a person who paid everybody back exactly and owed nothing to anyone was not admirable. He was a man on his way out. The word in the mountains was a working, and it covered a category rather than an event. A house raising, where the neighborhood assembled a log structure in a day or two. A log rolling, to clear new ground. Men and oxen dragging felled timber into heaps for burning. A corn shucking, where a season's crop got husked in an evening by 30 people who turned it into a party while they worked. A hog killing in the first hard cold, which is more work than one family can do before the meat spoils. A bean string. A molasses boiling that has to run continuously for hours. An apple butter stirring, the same. A quilting where a top piece alone over months got stitched into a finished quilt in a single day by a ring of women around a frame. The regional newspapers recorded these as ordinary business rather than as charm. In April of 1890, at Deep Creek in North Carolina, the men worked at John Schuler's place while the women spent the day quilting. 2 workforces. One day, one household's needs are met. Look at the structure of it, because the design is precise. Every one of those tasks shares a property. It is time-critical and lumpy. It cannot be spread out. A hog killed in December has to be cut, salted, and packed before it turns. A wall has to go up while there are men holding it. Sorghum has to be boiled the day it is pressed. A house cannot be raised at 10% per week. So a household's labor needs were not a steady line. They were a flat plane with a handful of enormous spikes in it. And a family of 6 simply does not contain enough hands to meet a spike, no matter how hard those 6 people work, and no matter how early they get up. The working solves that, and it does it without money. 20 families each face a handful of spikes a year at different times, and by moving labor around, they cover every one of them. Nobody hires anyone. Nobody is short. There is a second design feature worth noticing. Almost every one of these workings was arranged so that the labor and the sociability happened in the same hours. A corn shucking had music in it, and courtship, and a jug going round. A quilting had the older women teaching the younger ones by sitting them at the frame. A hog killing fed everybody who came. None of that was a reward bolted onto the work afterwards. It ran simultaneously, because a scattered rural population that only assembled for emergencies would have had no way to know each other well enough to be useful in one. And the food matters, which people mistake for hospitality. The household that called the work-in fed everybody, generously, at real expense. The best they had, laid on all day. That was not decoration. It was the visible, public, witnessed portion of the exchange. It was the receipt. But the food was never the payment. If it had been, this would be a labour market with a bad exchange rate. The payment was something else, and it is where the rule actually lives. What those men carried home from that house raising was a claim, not a written one. Nobody in that hollow recorded a thing. But every adult in the neighbourhood held, in their head, a running account of who had come to work, who had sat up with the dead, who had sent a boy over when somebody was down sick, and who had not. That mental ledger was the most important financial instrument in the mountains, and it had properties that make it very unlike anything we use now. First, it was not barter. A barter is settled at the moment of exchange. I give you this, you give me that, we are done. This was not that. You gave labour today with no agreement about what came back, when or in what form. You might give a day of roofing and receive, 4 years later, a woman sitting up all night with your sick child. There was no exchange rate, and asking for one would have been an insult. Economists call that generalized reciprocity. In practice, it means the account is deliberately imprecise, which is the only thing that lets it stretch across decades and across radically different kinds of help. Precision would have killed it. The moment you can say exactly what a day of roofing is worth in nights of nursing, you have a market, and a market can be settled and walked away from. Second, and this is the rule, you must never get square. A debt held open is a relationship held open. If every account were settled exactly, everybody would be free of everybody, and the whole web would dissolve into a set of strangers who happened to live near each other. So the system ran, permanently, on mutual indebtedness. Everybody owed somebody. Everybody was owed. Nobody wanted to be balanced, and a man who tried to pay off his obligations precisely, who insisted on cash, who refused to accept help, who made sure he owed nothing, was not respected for his independence. He was understood to be withdrawing. Third, you went for people you did not like. This is the part that gets sanded off in the nostalgic version, and it is the part that made the system work. The obligation was not friendship, it was not affection, it is attached to proximity, not to fondness. There were men in every hollow who had fallen out over a boundary line or a hog or a courtship or a 30-year-old insult, and they showed up at each other's workings anyway and worked all day and went home. There is a detail from the death customs that makes this vivid. During the sitting up with the dead, the night-long vigil, which we will come to, people who had not spoken to each other in months could end up in the same room. The obligation overrode the quarrel, not because anyone forgave anything, but because the alternative was to be a person who did not come, and that was worse. Fourth, the enforcement was total, because nobody could leave. There was no anonymity. Your reputation was the only credit rating in existence. It was held by people who had known your family for 4 generations, and there was no other neighborhood to move to. Fail to show up, and you were not fined or sued. You were simply, quietly, not helped. And in a place with no insurance, no bank, no hospital, and no relief. That was a sentence. There was a fifth property, less obvious, and just as important. The ledger was inherited. A young man arriving at his first job was not starting from zero. He was carrying his father's standing, and his grandfather's, and everybody in that field knew what it was. Reputation in these communities ran across generations, which meant a family that had shown up reliably for 40 years had a balance its children could draw on, and a family that had not was starting from a hole nobody had told them about. Put those five together, and you have something remarkable. An insurance market with no premiums, no contracts, no adjusters, and no fraud, enforced entirely by memory. The workings are the visible half of the system. They are the part people photograph. But they were never what the rule was for. The rule was for the day something went wrong, and here is what that looked like. A man breaks his leg in July. July is when the corn is laid by and the hay comes in, and a household that misses that window does not eat in February. So the neighbours work his crop, not as a gesture, as a scheduled task, fitted around their own until he is on his feet. A barn burns. A barn is a year of somebody's life, and the entire winter shelter for their stock, and losing one in October is losing the animals too. It gets rebuilt by everybody, and the raising is called within days rather than months, because the calendar does not wait for a family to recover. A woman goes into labour. There is no hospital. What arrives is the granny woman, midwife, herbalist, and the whole of the medical system within a day's ride, who is paid in butter or eggs or corn or nothing at all, and other women come and stay and cook and take the other children. Somebody is sick for weeks. The house fills with food, and it keeps coming without anybody coordinating it, and somebody is always there. A husband dies and leaves a woman with young children. There is no pension, no life insurance, no widow's benefit, and in a great many cases no clear title to the land. What she has is her husband's standing in the ledger, and the crop gets put in, and the wood gets cut, and it goes on for years, and somebody dies, which is where the rule shows its full shape. Before funeral homes, death was handled entirely by the neighbourhood. Word travelled fast, and people came. The body was washed and dressed at home by family and neighbours, laid out in the front room, the room we now call the living room, which was the room the dead were kept in. A handmade quilt was often laid over the coffin. Flowers and herbs were set around it, partly for beauty and partly to mask what happens to a body in a house with no refrigeration. And then, for 1 to 3 days, the body was never left alone. People took turns through every night. That is where the name comes from, sitting up with the dead. And while they sat, they told stories and sang lined-out hymns, one voice giving the words and the room answering back. Meanwhile, other people were doing the rest of it. Neighbours dug the grave. Neighbours built the coffin. Neighbours fed the family, who were not expected to cook or arrange or decide anything at all. Now consider what that arrangement did for the bereaved, because it is not obvious to us. They were not asked to do anything. They did not organize a funeral, or select a casket, or notify anyone, or feed the visitors, or be alone in the house at 3 a.m. with the worst thing that had ever happened to them. Every one of those tasks was absorbed automatically by people who arrived without being called. Nobody had to ask. That is the actual payout of the rule, and it is the thing that has no modern equivalent at any price. You can buy a funeral. You can buy childcare, meals, home nursing, crop insurance, and a builder. What you cannot buy is a dozen people who show up before you have worked out that you need them. Now, this kind of video usually skips, and it has to be said clearly, because the version where a beautiful thing was stolen from innocent people is false. They gave it up, largely on purpose. And they had reasons. The system was replaced, piece by piece, by things that worked better. Wage labor meant you could hire a man rather than owe him. Cash meant a transaction could actually be closed. Insurance meant a burned barn was a claim rather than a favor. The New Deal and the programs that followed meant a widow had something other than the goodwill of her husband's brothers. Hospitals and funeral homes took over the two occasions, birth and death, where the old obligations bore hardest. Every one of those is an improvement, and people took them as fast as they arrived, exactly as they took the cook stove and the carding mill and the bag of pintos off the rail car. And the population physically dispersed. Wage work in the mill villages and the coal camps pulled families off the ridges, and then in the 20th century, the great out-migration took millions of Appalachians north to Cincinnati, Dayton, Detroit, and Chicago. A ledger held in the heads of 20 families does not survive those families moving to 4 states. But there is a second reason, and it is the honest one. The old system was also a cage. It ran on total visibility, and total visibility is not only warmth, it is surveillance. Everybody knew your business, your finances, your marriage, your drinking, your religion, and your politics. And the same mechanism that delivered a dozen men to your barn. Raising also delivered a verdict on how you lived. It punished non-conformity. A person who was different in belief, in temperament, in whom they loved, in what they wanted to do with their life, could not simply hold a private opinion in a place where reputation was the currency. It was frequently hard on outsiders and on anybody the neighborhood decided was not one of theirs. And it was inescapable by design. The enforcement worked precisely because you could not leave, which means the people it was hardest on were trapped in it. Plenty of people got on a bus for Detroit and felt something they had never felt in their lives, which was anonymity, and it was a relief. And it should be said that the burden inside the system was not distributed evenly either. The men's obligations were episodic, a day at a raise-in, a night at a wake. The women were continuous. The food that appeared at every sickness and every funeral was cooked by somebody. The children who were absorbed into other households were minded by somebody, and the nursing that went on for weeks was done by somebody. The rule was carried disproportionately and largely invisibly by women who were never asked whether they wanted to carry it. So the honest verdict is that the rule was not simply lost, it was traded. Real security and real belonging, exchanged for real freedom and real privacy, by people who understood both sides of the deal and mostly chose the second. The trouble is that we spent the money and did not notice the bill. In May of 2023, the Surgeon General of the United States published an 80-page advisory called Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation. Vivek Murthy's argument in it is not a soft one. He put social connection alongside tobacco, obesity, and addiction as a public health priority, and the numbers behind that are specific. Lacking social connection is associated with an increased risk of premature death comparable to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day, and a greater mortality impact than obesity or physical inactivity. Social isolation is associated with roughly a 29% increase in risk of premature death. Loneliness around 26%. A 29% increased risk of heart disease, a 32% increased risk of stroke. For older adults, a 50% increased risk of developing dementia. Even before the pandemic, about half of American adults reported measurable loneliness. And across every age group, people were spending less time with each other in person than 2 decades earlier, with the sharpest fall among people aged 15 to 24, whose in-person time with friends dropped by around 70%. Murthy's framing is worth quoting for its bluntness. He argued that we have an opportunity and an obligation to invest in social connection the way the country has invested in addressing tobacco, obesity, and addiction. That is the bill for a trade that has been running for a century, and it is worth being precise about what it is not. It is not evidence that mountain life was better. Those households buried children at rates nobody would tolerate now, and the security they had was purchased with a surveillance nobody should want. But it does establish something. The thing that was traded away was not sentimental. It was load-bearing, and its absence is measurable in mortality data. So, what is actually relearnable? Not the hollow. The conditions are gone. You cannot manufacture 20 families who cannot leave, and you would not want to. What transfers is the mechanic, and it is smaller, stranger, and more specific than the usual advice about community, which tends to go outside and meet people. 1. The ledger must stay open. The modern instinct after receiving help is to settle immediately, to send money, to return the favor at equal value, to get square as fast as possible. That instinct feels like courtesy, and it is corrosive because it closes the account. The mountain version deliberately left it open, because an open account is a reason to come back. 2. Asking is the contribution. This is the one that will be hardest for most people watching. In that system, the man who called a house raising was not begging. He was creating the occasion, giving 20 families a legitimate reason to be in the same field, and giving each of them a claim on him. Asking for help was the mechanism by which the network was maintained. Never needing anything was not strength, it was defection. 3. Turn up with a task, not an offer. Nobody at that funeral asked the family what they needed. They dug the grave, they built the coffin, they took the children, they cooked. The phrase, "Let me know if there's anything I can do," sounds generous, and it quietly transfers the entire work of identifying, requesting, and coordinating onto the person least capable of doing any of it, which is precisely the design flaw the old system did not have. 4. Proximity beats affection, the obligation attached to who was near, not to who was liked. Almost all modern connection is organized around affinity. We assemble friends who resemble us, who share our interests and our opinions, and who can be dropped when they stop being enjoyable. That produces pleasant relationships and fragile ones. A network built only on liking each other has no way to survive being inconvenient, and the moments when you actually need it are by definition inconvenient. The people who dug that grave were not chosen. They were simply the ones who lived there. And that is the whole of it. The rule was never be kind to your neighbors. Kindness is optional, and it comes and goes. The rule was that you are permanently, deliberately, unresolvably in debt to the people around you, and that you keep it that way on purpose, because the debt is the thing that holds the whole structure up. Those men walked home from that house raising owing nothing and owed nothing on paper. What they carried was better than payment. They carried the certainty that when their own roof came off, or their own leg broke, or their own child died in the night, they would not have to ask. Somebody would already be walking up the road.